people think, well, I'll just take more thyroid medication, and your body's like, anything you put in, it's going to disturb an equilibrium. For every action, there's a reaction. Let's take everything away and just eat meat.
In this interview with Sarah Pugh, a quantum biologist who understands the way the human body works better than anyone else I've ever had on my channel, we talk about why the human body runs better on fat, how vegetables can cause harm to the mitochondria, and the hard science behind why we need to eat locally. Then we get into hormones, and she explains whether or not we need carbohydrates to have optimal levels of testosterone or cortisol. We get into the science of why carnivore can heal psychiatric disorders like bipolar, as well as the reasons why psychiatric meds that work on serotonin receptors do not actually work at all. Next, we discuss deuterium, raw meat, the 6 things that we need to do to optimize our circadian rhythm, and the inherent biases and agendas of almost all studies done today. She is absolutely brilliant. You won't want to miss this one. Enjoy. I've watched a lot of your YouTube videos, and you just kind of blow me away with your knowledge of quantum biology, quantum physics, human physiology, neurology. I mean, you have an expertise in so many areas, and I'm just really looking forward to getting the perspective of someone so educated on carnivore diets, and maybe you can help establish whether or not they're actually healthy, or we should stop doing them. So again, I appreciate you coming on, and we're going to get into a lot of really interesting topics today.
Oh no, it's great to be on with you. Like I was saying, I think you're going to be the next Lex Friedman, so we're all really lucky to know you now.
Thanks. I hope so. I love Lex. Yeah. Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself before we get into some of the topics that I've prepared. Tell me a little bit about yourself and just your background.
Do you mean like from education? So
Sure.
basically, I did a degree in biochemistry and genetics, and then I did a master's in bioinformatics. Then I did a PhD in molecular mechanisms, but that PhD, that's where the quantum physics and the biophysics came in, because I did single molecule protein folding. So that's would relate to Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's and stuff like that, but also a lot of fluorescence and shining light at molecules, which when we talk about hormones later, I think we may discuss that. Then I did a postdoc on statins and cholesterol. I did a few projects before that, and that's when I got really disillusioned with science, because, as I was telling you, there was a massive pressure in 2006 to publish data saying statins were a good thing. And back then, cholesterol was like the evilest of the evil molecules. Obviously, we know totally different now. And that's when I saw through the whole system. And then I left science to pursue my own career. I worked as a Pilates teacher because I just wanted to get away from education for a bit, and that's how I got to be comfortable with the general public and how to talk to them about science. But I always kept up with scientific knowledge. Then I got massively into supplements, and then fell out with supplements. So probably spent about 10,000 or more dollars on them, and tried pretty much everything. There are a few I like. Then I got into hypnosis because I found I couldn't get my clients to do things. So if you work with them on a psychological level, you can get more compliance. Then I got into fasting and ketogenic diets, but I already knew about ketogenic diets because I had some like catastrophic mental health problems. They're all better now. When I was doing my PhD, and I discovered the Atkins diet then, but I never made the connection between mental health and ketogenic diets until a couple of, probably actually much more recently, till I met Dr. Georgia Eid. Have you come across Georgia Eid?
Yeah. Haven't talked to her,
Yes.
but I'd love to at some point.
Oh yes, oh no, you should. She'd be a really interesting person on the channel. So yeah, that's when I kind of, the penny dropped about ketogenic diets and mental health. But before that, I was helping people who had diabetes and just general sort of ways of changing their ways of eating. And then, because I'm always trying to solve problems, like I always thought, well, maybe it's the diet, maybe it's the movement. Then I got into functional neurology because I thought, well, it must be the nervous system, and there was still things I couldn't solve. Then I got into quantum biology, which is looking at biology through the lens of a quantum physicist. So looking at electrons, protons, deuterium, and light is really important as well. And just viewing the body from a different perspective gave me a broader view of maybe this is why people are having problems.
Yeah, it's incredible. So tell me what happens when we're burning fat for fuel rather than carbs. What's the difference? Why is one better than the other?
Okay, so when for people who are not sure of the biochemistry, food goes in, and what comes out of the mitochondria at the other end would be ATP and exclusion zone water, infrared, carbon dioxide, and light. And the way this is powered is it's by electrons. There's the electron transport chain, and electrons are a bit like money in the cell. So the more electrons you've got going down the electron transport chain, the more goodies that are coming out. So when you look at a fat, a molecule, there's way more electrons in the bonds in fat than there is in, say, glucose. So straight away, if more electrons go in, more goodies come out at the end. Secondly, the way that the cell or the mitochondria accesses the electrons, it's more efficient if you're burning fat, and also the electrons from fat go straight to complex 2, and complex 1 is the one that leaks a little bit. It leaks electrons, so this is important for something else to do with autophagy, but on the whole it's more efficient, and it makes more sense thermodynamically to burn fat as a fuel. So it's cleaner, it's more efficient. But also, if you look at things like the Baltimore studies, where they followed massive cohorts of people for, I think, over 10 years, they found that those with the RQs, or the respiratory quota of a fat burner, just have better metabolic profiles overall. So there is actually, like, biophysical reasons which you can't argue with quantum physics, but there's also enormous studies of cohorts to show that it is better to be a fat burner than a carb burner.
Well, what's the significance of more ATP output? I've seen a lot of research on, for example, seed oils sort of inhibiting the output of ATP. So why does having more energy equate to a higher state of health?
That's a really difficult question to answer, because I personally think that ATP is not as important as the exclusion zone water, because the exclusion zone water, there's a whole study on it. There's a professor called Professor Gerald Pollack, and he's studied this easy or structured water. And this is basically like an additional molecular battery inside our cells, because the way that water lines up, it allows for information. It's basically like an information superhighway. And this structured water is really important in our blood vessels, because it sort of keeps everything flowing smoothly. It's vital for fascia, because fascia needs to slide. And when you don't have enough exclusion zone water, you're going to be in pain. When it comes to having sort of, if you have less ATP, if you think about how ATP is made, you have ADP and you've got phosphate. If you've got less ATP, you're going to have more phosphate and ADP, and phosphate itself is one of the triggers for inflammation. So if you're not having enough end product and you're building up too much precursors, that phosphate can also increase inflammation. So if you're making less ATP, because ATP gets made in complex 5, or the ATP synthase, whereas the EZ water gets made at complex 4. But if you've got less of one, you're going to have less of the other, because it's implying that there's something wrong with the electron transport chain, because you're probably losing electrons on the way, and lost electrons are free radicals. So it's a very good question, because it's also you've got less end products, but the process by which you having less end products is also a problem within itself, because you've got all these lost electrons damaging the cell as well. So that would be maybe the answer to the question you were looking for. Do you want a bit more?
No, you explain things in a way that makes so much sense. I'm so happy that you're on. Yeah.
And you get less infrared, because the mitochondria make heat. They run about 10 degrees hotter than everything else. And anybody who's followed the red light and infrared research from the panels, it's like all the rage, whereas we can make our own infrared internally. And there's vast amounts of studies on infrared for everything from eczema to migraines to pain to better eyesight. Whereas, if you can make it all inside yourself, you're going to get all of those benefits as well. And it took me about 10 years to make the connection between how does ketogenic diets help migraines. And then one day I realized, it's the infrared is part of it. So yes, there's a lot more to the mitochondria than just ATP. And again, making sure that they're protected is vital for health. And I think when we talk about different ways of eating, it'll become apparent why certain ways are not very friendly to the mitochondria.
Yeah. So, okay, why would a carnivore diet work from your perspective? I mean, a keto diet, it has lots of animal foods, but it also has things like vegetables, which have anti-nutrients. From the point of view of a quantum biologist, how may the plant toxins actually negatively affect our health?
Okay, there's actually something else that, from a quantum biology perspective, I think is really important to talk about: pesticides and glyphosate, because
Okay.
glyphosate is incredibly destructive to the collagen and the structured water in the body, because the way that the Z water arranges itself around collagen is slightly different, and glyphosate is horrendously destructive. And I think if you exclude plants, then you're automatically going to exclude glyphosate. And like lots of things, Monsanto likes to sort of continuously try and say that people like me are talking rubbish about glyphosate replacing glycines in the collagen. So that would be one reason, from a sort of looking at things from a different perspective. Then in terms of the plant toxins themselves, from a biology perspective, it's to do with things like lectins disturb the insulin signaling, and we all know that we have a terrible insulin resistant problem to start with. Then we've got all of the different toxins which chelate important minerals and make them unavailable. And in terms of other plant toxins, it's very popular to, like, seeds are all the rage. Like pumpkin seeds have got magnesium, and people say, oh, they've got tryptophan and all of this. But then the seed is probably the worst bit of the plant you can eat, because it's the most well defended, yet it's the most praised. Same as the plants that have got oxalates in them, the green ones. And then also in terms of like secondary toxins, I would probably classify fructose as a toxin, would you? Because we could only process 15 grams. And if you're eating a lot of oxalate and then you're eating a lot of fructose, you're just making the perfect storm for kidney stones, because uric acid also contributes to kidney stones as well as oxalates.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. So why is it that you think people on these fruitarian diets, well, like, I mean, they all pretty much fail. Why is it that Paul Saladino, do you think, is experiencing benefits from adding fruit? I know it's kind of a random question, but
No, I think it is because it's back to sunlight and deuterium, and because if you live somewhere, because he lives in Costa Rica, and you've got such a huge amount of sunlight, and he walks around pretty much with hardly any clothes on all the time. So as we were saying, that the more sunlight you have, the healthier you are, the better you can manage carbohydrates, and the more deuterium you can deplete. And I know from, I do know some of his routines. He does get up, see the sunrise. He grounds a lot. He goes to bed early. Has a lot of sort of anti-EMF tech. You know, he really he's got a very good circadian rhythm, but that's because he lives in the most optimal place. I mean, if me or you lived there, we could probably eat what he does. I can't possibly eat what he would in the UK. I'd just be leptin and insulin resistant within like 2 months. I just couldn't cope with the carbohydrate. So I think with him, it's a bit like Wim Hof, who I think he's plant-based, isn't he? He's so in touch with nature. He is so sort of grounded, and he doesn't wear very many clothes either. And I can't remember where he lives, but you know, he can get away with, you know, this extra amount of carbohydrate where other people can't. Because if you think about where all the tropical fruit grows, it grows in places on the equator, and you know, this comes back to eating seasonal and local food. That's why you shouldn't be eating pineapples in New York on Christmas Day, or eating mangoes ever in the UK, because the photosynthetic stamp on them is completely wrong for us, and that really confuses the mitochondria. Whereas with Paul Saladino, he lives where the pineapples live, so his mitochondria and his biology are expecting these kind of fruits and the kind of levels of sugar that they're contained. Whereas to advocate it to people, say, who live in Norway, would just be a disaster.
Is sunlight the only factor? So, for example, if someone is in 100-degree weather, Fahrenheit, in Costa Rica versus 100-degree weather in Rome, can they eat the same amount of foods, or are there other aspects of the environment that can impact what fruits you should be eating?
The thing is, the person in Rome should be eating whatever's grown there, because if the person in Rome bought a pineapple from Costa Rica, it's so alien to their mitochondria that the mitochondria in Rome are expecting tomatoes and whatever other fruit that grows locally. Whereas if you stick a pineapple in, the photosynthetic stamp's wrong because it's coming from the wrong location. Because neurologically, the way our brains and bodies work, our brain always has to know exactly where we are in space and when and where all our joints are, and if it can't do that, it just creates chaos, which is also inflammation. So to know where we are, our brain does rely on the food we're bringing in, because it helps it to know, okay, it's this time of year and I'm in UK or Costa Rica. And the whole thing about grounding, that's to do with the Earth's magnetism, that your brain always needs to know, well, where am I in space? And if you're always inside with sort of shoes on, you're never grounded to the earth. How can your brain kind of get a geolocation? So this is where the quantum biology gets sort of quite deep. Whereas if your brain knows exactly where you are, you're always grounded, you've got a brilliantly strong nervous system that knows exactly where all your joints are at any given time, because Paul does a lot of surfing, he's always in the sea, and the water's grounding as well. So when it comes to having ticked a lot of boxes, he can get away with this amount, the amount of like fruit and carbs, whereas somebody else who works in an office all day under blue light just hasn't got a strong enough constitution. And not that I dislike Paul, I think he's very intelligent, but I just think it's misleading people. If you just say outright, if you live in this environment, please eat what I eat. If you live in the UK, then please don't, because it's not right for you.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Your explanation of grounding is making me really think. That's really fascinating. So our bodies can actually know where we are, be in tune with our environment, and thus our mitochondria is more expecting certain things and not others. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
But also with grounding, it's back to electrons, because the reason the Earth's negatively charged is because electricity is always striking it, and it gets dispersed all over the Earth. So we can get more electrons in, and the electrons we get from grounding are not quite the same as the food electrons, because the food electrons come via acetyl-CoA. So there's like a physical molecule which regulates whether we're going to store energy, make cholesterol, burn energy, whereas the electrons that come in with grounding are kind of getting in the back door. And this is to do with people and overeating, that if you're grounding a lot and you've got a really good supply of electrons, you're not going to be so hungry for food electrons. And people look at me like I've got two heads sometimes, but when people are out in nature and out in summer, they just eat less, and they don't even know why. And it's a lot of, when you break things down to the level of the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons, a lot of things start to make sense.
Yeah. They're already starting to make sense for me. So can you talk a little bit about hormones? I know this is a vast topic, but there's a lot of pushback against the carnivore space, with people saying, well, not eating carbs is going to tank your testosterone. It's going to boost your cortisol. You're going to be stressed all the time in a constant starvation state. Your body's going crazy. It's not working. Well, I know it's a broad, pretty general question, but can you talk a little bit about zero carb diets or low carb diets and how that affects our hormones?
Okay, I think there are like different kinds of low carb and zero carb diets, because we've got the ketogenic diet that's kind of, say, 70 to 80 grams of protein, and then it could be like 180 grams of fat, and then maybe 20 grams of sort of carbs. Then we've got carnivore, which would be more of, sometimes carnivore is 50-50, like a 1-to-1 of protein to fat. So we've got different sorts of low carb. But I would say, whenever like I have to think about something on the spot, I always think, okay, well, where does cortisol come from? And it's going to get made from pregnenolone. And the most important thing about cortisol is that without it, you die. And every other hormone, like the sex hormones that we have, we can live without those. But when it comes to cortisol, it's the most important one of all. So your body's going to prioritize its resources into just making that hormone. So I always think, well, why is the body making cortisol in the first place? What are you doing to upset it? And a lot of the time with cortisol dysregulation, it's got nothing to do with food. It's to do with circadian rhythms and melatonin and cortisol being out of line, because they kind of oppose each other. So this is again an example of people blaming a diet for a bad circadian rhythm, because somebody might be on their phone all night and not and then they wake up the next day all cortisol-y and stressed, and it's got nothing to do with the keto diet. It's because they were stressed about something else. Back to what I was saying about the electron transport chain and the leaky the leaky part of it. For some people, it is beneficial for them now and again to eat some local and in season sort of plant-based thing, because you want that leakage on purpose, because it's going to tell your body to do some autophagy, because it sensed the leaky electrons. So it goes, oh no, let's try and fix this. However, you can get the same effect with more protein, because that can be metabolized as carbohydrate as well. But on the other hand, certain people, like some women, as we get a bit older, if we eat too much protein and not enough carbs, that can raise our cortisol. But that's to do with, you have to really look in depth into whose cortisol is high, why is it high, is it just the food, and are they I don't want to say doing it wrong, but are they calorie restricting? Maybe is that why their cortisol's high? Are they fasting in the morning, and that'll raise your cortisol? Are they doing like lots of HIIT workouts and then blaming the way of eating? Have they got leptin resistance? Because that's also can make people's cortisol go high. So I think cortisol is much more complicated and much more multifaceted than, say, something like insulin, which is a little bit simpler to unpick. So I wouldn't say that you can go around and say that categorically keto or carnivore diets raise cortisol, because any diet can raise cortisol, especially if you're under eating or eating bad quality, because you can eat bad quality carnivore and keto, and maybe that's what's raising the cortisol. You'd have to look at it, I think, person by person basis and say, show me what you're eating, when you're eating, and what else are you doing, when are you going to bed, when are you getting up, and then let's see really what's going on with this cortisol. And then it might be that they're going through a divorce, or they hate their university course and they happen to start a carnivore or keto diet. So it's all much more multifaceted than low carb causes high cortisol. Although I have heard that before, because I also, back to the Ray Peat sort of thing that I went through, you can people can blame cortisol, whereas actually, how do you know it's not high adrenaline or high norepinephrine? Because that would give the person the same unpleasant feeling. So unless you're actually doing tests like Dutch tests, how do you know?
Sorry, this is not related, but I thought adrenaline and epinephrine were the same thing.
Oh, sorry, I meant to say norepinephrine.
Oh, yeah. Oh, is norepinephrine different?
Oh no, it's what I did. I forgot that like in the UK and America, we call it adrenaline and noradrenaline. You say epinephrine and
Okay.
norepinephrine.
Okay.
I just mixed the two up to make it sound like it was totally different molecules. So no, that was just me, my mistake.
Got it. Okay, just making sure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the sex hormones like progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, and we might have to bring in cholesterol, which we're going to get to in a sec. But how might those be affected by a carnivore diet? Would someone on a carnivore diet have to worry, you think, about low testosterone?
No, because you're going to be getting ample cholesterol, which is the backbone to your steroid hormones, but also pregnenolone, which is really important. Is you need vitamin A to make pregnenolone, and that comes from a good quality animal sources, because the retinoic acid is the form that we need, and the beta carotene unfortunately isn't the right form. So when it comes to making hormones, if you're eating keto, or well, we'll say carnivore for now, you've already got the mother steroid hormone, the pregnenolone. And from that, because you're eliminating carbohydrates, which there are many studies that go back a very long time from Kellogg's and Quaker that show that too much carbohydrate is going to tank your testosterone. So we've eliminated those. So that allows the pathway to proceed. When meat contains a lot of zinc, which is really important for producing these sex hormones. So you've basically got things which are going to promote making these sex hormones, and you've excluded things which are going to inhibit making these sex hormones. It's slightly different in men and women, because obviously we have 10 times more estrogen and you've got 10 times more testosterone, but the principle is the same, that for people who like we were talking before, that a lot of the reason the carnivore diet works is it's what you're excluding and what you're including.
And I guess somewhat unrelated to the diet, what are other ways, just given that you've studied neurology and you can probably speak to this, what are other ways that we would want to optimize testosterone levels?
Sleep is really important. Not overtraining, that can tank people's testosterone. Obviously, being female, I'm not an expert in testosterone, but I would also say that when it comes to making hormones of any sort, getting enough sunlight of UVA in the morning is really important, because it's not only going to photo stamp things like your serotonin, which gets turned into melatonin later, or thyroid hormone. All of the sex hormones, if you look at the structures of them, they've got lots of rings in them, and these kind of molecules trap light, because I spent like 5 years of my life shining light at tryptophans and tyrosine. So as soon as I thought about it, I was thinking sunlight is really important as well. And also I think there's quite a big movement of using infrared on like certain parts of your anatomy, like people put it on their bits and their like they go naked or butt naked in the sun, and men I know swear that this improves their testosterone, but I do actually believe them, knowing what I know about light. So I think light of the appropriate kind is really important for testosterone production. And also doing a dopamine fast would help, because the way that dopamine and testosterone work, if you're constantly stimulating dopamine, you're going to affect your testosterone. So I think if somebody is struggling with low testosterone, there's huge amounts of things they can do, and doing a dopamine fast, as in get off anything like technology, no fap, all of that for a bit, can help. And then obviously you need the building blocks to make the testosterone in the first place, because you could do everything right, but if you've got really low cholesterol, well, there's not enough precursor. And then if you don't have enough vitamin A, then you haven't got the backbone. Also, you need vitamin D as well. So that's part of the hormones as well. So sunlight plays a role in this as well. But I think there's still more to it that we don't fully understand about hormones and light.
Yeah, and that all makes sense. Given that we used to have a testosterone of 1500 in Paleolithic times, and that was a time when we were eating lots of meat, getting lots of sunlight, lots of, not as much dopamine stimulation. It would make sense that if we just simply live in more of a way resembling that, we would be able to optimize our hormones to a far greater degree than we would just living our current lives, where we're just constantly stimulating dopamine and lowering baseline dopamine and thus lowering testosterone.
There's actually more to it, because we've got all the problems of phytoestrogens and all of the contraceptive pills in the water. So what men could do would be to invest in a water filter, minimize plastic, because obviously estrogen dominance, it happens to men and women. So it can be you can either have not enough testosterone or too much estrogen. And then you've got to look at things like your aromatase enzymes, because sometimes you can make lots of testosterone, it just gets converted straight away into estrogen, because testosterone is always there first. So that would be another angle for people to look at, especially if they're worried. So less plastic, and with a carnivore diet, if you've got a good butcher or say a local farm, you can just go and buy the meat, and it's not messed about with and wrapped up in 25 different layers of plastic, like some of the foods that come in boxes, and it hasn't been in a factory, and it's probably rubbed up against more plastic in there. The other thing which is really important would be other environmental toxins. And plants tend to harbor them more than animals do. I mean, obviously the animal toxins that we come across is from people who've been injecting their farm animals with hormones and things. But when it comes to unpleasant things like cadmium and arsenic and stuff, often things like rice can be really, really contaminated with heavy metals and stuff like that, which are going to really disturb your hormone production. So unfortunately, we're hit from so many different angles with low testosterone. But I would say that going and doing a carnivore diet would be an easy way to mitigate some of these problems, just as long as you're eating a relatively clean carnivore diet, not just loads of sausages wrapped up in
Yeah.
plastic and stuff like that.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about birth control? Do you know anything about it?
To some extent, yes. I think it's a topic that it's like other medication. It serves its purpose, but I think we have insufficient data to really understand the ramifications of birth control, because when my mum took birth control, I think it was 70 times stronger than the birth control that is around nowadays. And because the hormones come from a factory, they're not light stamped. Our body knows we didn't make them, and our body tends to abhor stuff that's not ours. And I think the more things that you take that you didn't make yourself, the more likely you are to provoke your immune system over time. So again, the less you can provoke that, the better. Because like a lot of things, autism, autoimmune diseases are massively skyrocketing. And I think that's another subject where carnivore is really, really powerful, because I've come across loads of people who've put their autoimmune into remission with a carnivore diet, because it doesn't provoke the immune system.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, let's get into cholesterol. You've done a lot of research on it. I think it's fascinating. I think it's amazing. I try to eat as much cholesterol as I possibly can. So, what is cholesterol and what does it do?
Okay, it's a molecule. It's a bit like cortisol, that it's that important that if you don't have any, you'll die. And it's so important our body makes it ourselves. And it's the backbone to a lot of our sex hormones, but also it plays a role in immunity. And it gives the cell membrane, because if we didn't have cholesterol in the cell membrane, it would be so wibbly and fluid, it wouldn't be able to hold itself together and be just completely useless. So it's fundamentally crucial for structure as well as function in the body. And because it's also anti-inflammatory, it gets blamed for all sorts. That's why whenever there's sort of like people talk about atherosclerotic plaques, the cholesterol happens to be in there, but it was only trying to help because it sensed there was damage to the glycocalyx. And there are so many like cholesterol lies. The poor molecule has been demonized, and I think bit by bit now it's been undemonized, because wasn't it in 2006 that the nutrition what's the Nutrition Society in the United States called, because it stated that cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern, because if you eat too much cholesterol, we've got receptors in the gut that don't absorb it, so it just gets pooed out, so it's impossible to eat too much of it anyway. And when it comes to making cholesterol, it gets made out of acetyl-CoA, which I mentioned earlier. So it's kind of this, again, it's that important for us that we make our own. And there are different sorts of cholesterol. Have you ever come across Dr. Stephanie Seneff's work about sulfate and the sulfated cholesterol?
I've heard of her. I haven't seen her work though.
Okay, yeah. So we've got the sulfated cholesterol. That then we've got the useless cholesterol that's been deuterated or got deuterium in it, which is a heavy hydrogen. Maybe we'll come back to that later.
Yeah.
But again, anybody that's worried about cholesterol needs to really check their knowledge base, because yes, we could get really deep into different bloods and stuff, because obviously the total cholesterol reading somebody might get from a lab and they panic because it's high is a completely useless reading altogether, because you want to look at the ratios of your HDL to LDL. And this again makes lots of people cross, because that's not even cholesterol. They're basically molecules that happen to have cholesterol in them. But the more I learn about cholesterol and LDL, the more I just think it's the biggest red herring ever for cardiovascular disease. And it's been demonized to cover up other much more sinister things. And I think it'll take maybe 10 years for all of the cholesterol nonsense to go away, but it's definitely not, it's something not to be frightened of. And if somebody does have high oxidized cholesterol, it's not because it's not the cholesterol's fault. If they're eating loads of seed oils and things like that, of course they're going to be making their own lovely cholesterol all oxidized and damaged.
Hmm. Really briefly, can you just explain what LDL and HDL are?
What high density lipoprotein and low density lipoprotein, just in really brief terms, what they are is it's like a postal system in the body, that they're basically little boats that they don't just carry cholesterol, they carry fat soluble vitamins, and one of them takes the cargo, and then it delivers it to the organs, and then the HDL comes and collects it and takes it back to the liver. And to look at it objectively, I don't really look at cholesterol anymore as a molecule. I look at the whole system. And if there's something wrong with your cholesterol bloods, you need to look at your whole postal system, because the way that LDL and HDL work, they're like, we'll talk about LDL because it's the one that people get really excited about. It needs to dock onto a receptor in order to deliver its cargo. Whereas if the receptor's been deuterated or glycosylated, it's basically blind. So the poor LDL can't dock and deliver. So it just goes round and round and round, like somebody from Amazon who's trying to deliver you a parcel. And then basically the LDL or the Amazon driver gets all the blame, whereas there's actually something wrong with the address of where the LDL was meant to be delivered. So that's another reason why when people try and show me bloods to do with cholesterol, I just glaze over, because I think they're completely useless, other than if you've got low HDL, you need to address that, because it's sort of one of the 5 markers of being insulin resistant.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of, even though I worked with it a long time, I'm very much, I don't think it's old news to me now. It's something that when someone starts going on about it, I just think, oh, for goodness sake, you're 10 years behind in the research. I'm not interested.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on it?
Oh yeah, I'm totally with you. I don't think high LDL is a problem at all. And just from, I mean, that was one of the first things that I started getting into, because my first concern with carnivore was saturated fat. Okay, well, are people concerned about saturated fat? Because it increases LDL. And then I heard Paul Saladino explaining LDL on Joe Rogan, and it all made so much sense. He gave like the bus example. He described basically what you said, where it's like a bus dropping off dropping off everything at the cells and the places that need it, dropping off the cholesterol and fat soluble vitamins, and I believe CoQ10 and other things as well. So yeah, it made plenty of sense to me. And just looking at it objectively without having ever seen studies or any of the paid research, you would just look at the system and think, okay, there's no possible reason why one would think LDL is a risk factor. And yeah, I'm totally with you. I don't think it is.
But also, if you look at the mortality data, that it's like, if you've got the more cholesterol you've got, the longer you live. And when they've looked at all of the heart attack data, it's just completely uncorrelated. But when you look at insulin resistance and low vitamin D and heart disease, that's when you see the correlation, whereas the cholesterol data is all over the place. I mean, obviously the famous study is Ansel Keys, who left out several countries because it didn't fit his narrative. But again, it's something that it's just old news, and it's people not understanding the fundamentals of biology. And I always say to people, if do you honestly think your body's going to make something that would poison you? And also, people jump up and down about it, and they forget that acetyl-CoA, every single thing you eat, like if you ate old boots and crocodile skin and loads of that, you're going to make loads of acetyl-CoA. So you can make cholesterol even if you ate loads and loads of fruit or anything in excess, because it's made out of acetyl-CoA, and every single thing that you eat turns into acetyl-CoA. So in a way, I don't even sort of buy the whole saturated fat argument either, because you can get high cholesterol, not that I even like that word, from eating other things because of how it's made and where it's made.
So, okay, but why is it then if like eating a lot of saturated fat doesn't increase acetyl-CoA at a rate faster than other foods, why would it be that so many people on carnivore diets or keto diets have an LDL increase and their LDL is higher than average?
I don't know. I've never I know that if you give something a lot of saturated fat, the cholesterol level rises. but I just think there's something wrong with all of the standards to do with readings in the first place, that what we are perceiving as a high level is probably normal, if that makes sense. That
Okay,
the whole,
okay.
I think the whole goalposts are wrong. Maybe
Mm,
I'm wrong, but that's what I'm beginning to think, because when did we start measuring cholesterol? We haven't got any readings from 100 years ago, so how do we know what it's supposed to be? I'm beginning to think that doing these keto and carnivore diets is returning the levels to normality, whereas these very low levels, when I'll have to look and find out when did we start doing bloods, but it probably would have been in the era of the margarine and the low the when fat was evil, so that the benchmarks would have been too low and we're returning to normal. That's my thoughts on it. So,
mm,
so that's why I don't know the biochemistry of why does saturated fat make cholesterol go up. I just think that I need to do some research and try and find out what the numbers should be, because I know they're always moving the goalposts when it comes to blood sugar, that all of a sudden we're allowed to have it, it's completely okay to have it as 110, whereas like 20 years ago, if it was over 90, it was too high. So that's why I get quite cross about cholesterol and labs. And the other thing about labs is, they can change within 3 hours. You can measure your cholesterol today, and if I measured it tomorrow, it can be 30% different. And this is across the board. And say if I measured my cholesterol with one lab and then went round the corner and measured it with another, it can be different. So that's why I'm really, I think biochemistry in terms of sort of biophysics, it can be basically what bloods are reporting is what's happened in the past. It's not what's actually happening right now. So you have to always be a little bit careful with reading. Obviously, it's really useful data, but always look a little bit deeper is what I say. Always just get 3 readings like any scientist would and compare. When I've done bloods, I've been quite shocked at how much it varies, even if I've gone the next day and measured the same thing.
hmm. Yeah. Then I've even heard of things like the Dave Feldman protocol, where if you don't want to have a high LDL for your insurance, because they're gonna make your rate so much higher, then you just like do some things to lower it the night before or something. And like, yeah, it's just so easy to manipulate those things. And so yeah, it doesn't really make sense that you're using your bloods as markers for health, especially when, like you said, the goalposts are constantly changing. And as we get sicker and sicker, their acceptance for sickness is raised. So people get sicker, they say it's okay to get sicker, and it's okay if we just make the threshold for you know, good health just much different than it should be, much lower than it should be.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, I think, isn't it, if you have a low reading, you're 2 standard deviations sicker than the average sick person. So again, when you have a low reading, it's not, oh, this is a bit low. It's like, this is absolutely catastrophically terrible. And if you're just in optimal for the blood test, that's probably suboptimal in terms of how well you could be feeling.
Yeah.
So, and actually, you raised something else really important about cholesterol, because once I did a 7-day fast, and my cholesterol total and everything just went like through the roof, and I went to my doctor to have a debate about it, because like at that time she didn't like the keto diet, and I said, well, I haven't even eaten anything for 7 days. How can this be like this? And you're telling me that my way of eating is making my cholesterol high. And then when I went and broke the fast and ate chocolate and rubbish, the whole thing normalized again, exactly as Dave Feldman would say, that when you're burning a lot of body fat, your own saturated fat, you're obviously going to produce an interesting cholesterol reading. But then the Dave Feldman stuff's fascinating, because yes, absolutely, you can manipulate the data and it's always eating something really unhealthy the day before. Like, you could do a fast, make it go up like I did, then you push yourself out of ketosis, and obviously I don't need the fat to be transported around to the organs anymore. And then it just goes back to something socially acceptable for the medical practice. But I think it's also, whenever it comes to pharmaceuticals and labels and numbers, it's because they want to prescribe a medication for somebody. So that's another reason why I'm a bit dubious about labs these days.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like just LDL isn't even it's like you said, it's not even correlated. I mean, the HDL to triglycerides ratio seems much more important. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, definitely. And also fasting insulin and GGT are really important markers for cardiovascular disease and stuff like that. So yes, it's, and also LDL is really important for immune system because it actually blinds bacteria. So say on your skin, if you've got plenty of LDL well, cholesterol in your skin and you cut it, the bacteria can't really see properly. So you're much less likely to get sort of an infection, because I have naturally quite high cholesterol and I'm forever cutting chunks out of myself in the garden. I've never had septicemia or anything. And I know people that they graze themselves on a rose bush and then they end up having to go to A&E because their whole arms become infected.
Hmm.
So cholesterol on the skin on the outside acts as a like a physical barrier, because I've always wondered that, why do some people cut themselves to shreds all the time and step on stuff in the garden and never get infections, and other people are constantly, they get scratched by something and it's red for days and days and days, and that's another role of cholesterol which people neglect.
Yeah, I was studying it, and so when you get a cut, right, that white layer that shows on the cut, that's
Yeah,
all made of cholesterol. And then I also saw this study where I think it was done in the 70s, where it was people who got severe burns were given 35 eggs per day, so
yeah.
thousands and thousands and thousands of milligrams of cholesterol, and they healed extremely fast. So yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. Cholesterol being a molecule for healing.
But also back to the eggs, that's all. I always have to look at things like, well, what else is going on? If you ate that many eggs, you're going to bump up your hormones a bit, and estrogen is really important for wound healing as well.
Hmm.
So again, if somebody was a bit low on hormones and they had all of those eggs, I think the egg itself is like great for making any kind of sex hormone. So there's always more. I've actually read that's the egg study as well.
Yeah. I mean, like sometimes if I'm like working really hard, I'll bring like a carton of eggs, like I have one right now.
Yeah.
I was like eat raw eggs. Like if I need to work and I'll just be able to think more. It's really yeah, like that's just something that I do. I find that I just get brain power from it. I feel good from it.
Oh yeah, the thing
Um
is, with eggs, my favorite are goose eggs because they're the best egg ever. And but the geese only lay in April and May, so I always buy as many as I can. But a goose egg is like a whole other level of like nootropic. Because duck eggs I always buy from the egg lady because I'm a bit of an egg snob now.
yeah.
And the once you've had a duck egg from a farm, like you're converted. But then when you've had a goose egg, or I've even bought an ostrich egg, I'm that keen. And it
Aren't
is
they
like you said,
huge?
yeah, they're massive. They're like this big, and you need a drill to get in.
Yeah.
But my mum and dad are quite my mum and dad are really keen on weird food, so they were kind of really excited about the ostrich egg. And we're always trying like these different game box is this obsession we've got at the moment of like of really good quality meat. But yeah, the ostrich egg, that and a goose egg, if somebody wants to try like another level of egg, those are the things, because geese are so fussy. You can't battery them or treat them badly. They just die if you don't raise them on grass where they're happy and free range. They just won't lay any eggs. So you can't get crap goose eggs because they refuse to eat rubbishy
Hmm.
stuff anyway. And
Cool.
if you try and battery them, they all just die.
Hmm. It's cool, yeah. So we didn't get to leptin when we were talking about hormones. I want to briefly touch back to that, and then we'll get to deuterium and some other things. Can you tell me a little bit about leptin and how important is it?
Okay, leptin is really high up in the hormone hierarchy. So leptin and oxytocin are kind of high up, and then below that we've got things like cortisol, melatonin, and insulin. So and then underneath that we've got the sex hormones. And the reason leptin is so interesting is it's because it's quite neglected, because it's multifaceted, because basically its job is it's like an accountant that every evening it docks to the hypothalamus and tells your brain how much energy or body fat you've got, and that means for the next day you're going to either burn an X amount or store X amount and eat X amount or not eat. So a lot of times with weight problems is if your body doesn't know how much fat is on you, it doesn't know whether it should be burning or storing. And because of the default setting is store, because it would be dangerous just to burn body fat for no reason because you die. So that's the first part with leptin, is that it regulates your appetite and reports on how much body fat you've got. It's also a circadian hormone because leptin gets made in fat cells, and fat's right under the skin, and light can penetrate, and red light penetrates really deep, and then the other light wavelengths penetrate to different degrees, with blue being the least penetrative. So it's influenced by sunlight and how much you go outside. So that's another factor. It's also dependent on when you eat, because if you eat a big massive meal at, say, 10 o'clock at night, leptin doesn't dock to the hypothalamus and tell the brain how much fat you've got and what to do the next day. So the whole system doesn't work. So the next day you just eat the wrong things because your brain thinks you're starving. And then the more you behave like that, the more leptin actually, I'll backtrack a bit. There is another layer to this. If you eat too much fructose, that blinds the leptin receptor in your brain as well. So when leptin can't dock, or the receptors blind, your body just starts to make more and more and more leptin, like it would for insulin resistance. So you can then become leptin resistant. And once you become leptin resistant, then you're open to being insulin resistant, because usually leptin resistance starts before insulin resistance. So the two are linked, but a lot of people don't talk about it. So that's what the problem with leptin is, that people forget that it's a circadian hormone, that if you're inside all the time and then watching Netflix in the evening and eating big meals, you're going to mess up your leptin. Or also, the other really important thing about leptin is it's very dependent on cortisol levels. So women who, say, fast in the morning and then like do CrossFit and then eat sort of calorie restricted, they can become leptin resistant as well. So lean people can be leptin resistant too, as well as people who are overweight. That's where people get tricked. The other thing that leptin does is it doesn't just regulate our body weight, it also regulates bone density, fertility, the immune system. So it's got all of these other functions as well. But that would make sense, because if somebody was, say, a woman was leptin resistant because she's over exercising and under eating, the body thinks, well, there's not enough fat here to make a baby, so therefore we won't make one. Then another thing to do with women in osteoporosis, to do with sort of bad eating habits. People love to blame calcium for it all, whereas I think calcium's got nothing to do with it, and leptin is part of this as well. So it's this massively complicated hormone. So say if somebody is leptin resistant, the way they might know they are is A, they would be, say, 15 pounds or more overweight. B, they've got a large appetite. C, they would be craving carbs before bed. And then D, when it comes to blood tests, they'd have high reverse T3, because leptin, as I said, controls your metabolism. The way it does that is it ramps up the amount of inactive thyroid that you've got. But also you can have a fasting leptin test, which is quite expensive, and leptin's pretty big and it can be a bit unreliable, but anything over 10 suggests you've got leptin resistance. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, why leptin is so important. But then people might want to know, well, I think I might be leptin resistant. Well, what do I do? And you'd have to look down and see, well, what's their diet like? If somebody's doing carnivore or keto, the reason they're leptin resistant is usually because they're fasting in the morning and over exercising. They're in that category of leptin resistant people. And then the people who are eating the standard American diet, they're in the class of eating way too much fructose, probably eating late in the evening to excess. So that's why it confuses people, because two totally what would look like distinct populations can both be leptin resistant. But I guess it's the same as insulin resistance. The majority of people who are insulin resistant would have obesity, but then you've got all of the people who are stressed that can be insulin resistant. Then you've got the thin people who are leptin resistant that are also insulin resistant. So insulin and leptin do walk hand in hand, but leptin is the boss of insulin.
I like that. It's leptin's the boss of insulin.
Yeah, but also leptin's the boss of thyroid as well, because with thyroid, people think, well, I'll just take more thyroid medication, and your body's like, no, well, I'll just turn your T3 into reverse T3. So no matter what you do, your body's always got an answer. It's like a complicated chess game that as soon as you start fiddling with hormones and putting anything you put in, it's going to disturb an equilibrium. That's why I'm kind of anti-supplements, even though, like I was saying, I've probably tried everything at some point. And the more you can do naturally and just let your hormones do their own thing, the more they're going to balance out quickly. Because for every action, there's a reaction. And there's so many things we don't understand about hormones yet. And no matter what you put in, your body's got to move like a really clever chess player, and it's going to do something, and it just makes
yeah.
everything even more complicated. Whereas if I'm much more now, let's take everything away and just eat meat and see what happens. And usually loads of things actually go away because it just simplifies the process. Okay, there might be some stuff you need to optimize later, but fundamentally I've gone back more, let's take stuff away rather than add things in.
Yeah, 100%. I think the way that we've sort of looked at hormones is really disturbing because people think that they can outsmart their physiology, but we can't, right? Like we can't change one thing and not expect any deleterious outcomes from changing our hormones. I think it's something that the much of the pharmaceutical industry got wrong, in that they can lower one thing or increase one thing, not at the expense of hurting something else though. So it doesn't seem to work.
But also, back to what we were saying about the sun and the UVA, that if you can get to UVA, say between 8 and 11 a.m., that's when the thyroid hormone serotonin get made. And if you think about that, probably SSRIs are in the UK for certain, that's probably the most popular drug that people are on. And then so many people are on thyroid medication. So it makes sense for the sun cream companies or whoever in their pocket to tell people, oh, don't go out in the sun, it's dangerous. Because if people then don't go out in the sun, they're not going to make less of their sex hormones. So that's the HRT business. Then they make less serotonin. So there we go. We have the SSRI business. And then we have the thyroid business as well, because tyrosine is what thyroid hormone's made out of. And once again, that's an aromatic light trapping molecule. So the more I think about it, the more I try to tell people to get high on their own supply. But this is back to people that they just sometimes just don't want to. And I always want to know, why. But then I think your parents are a good example of, my parents are the same. They'll just take whatever the doctor tells them. But maybe the answer to this is that why do people just want the pills? Why won't they just go out in the sun more, or maybe just try the carnivore diet for like I always just say, try it for 30 days and just see what happens. But still people just cling to their medication.
Yeah, because they'd rather accept the idea that what they're being told is true, that the world we live in is honest, that there are no malevolent intentions. They'd rather accept that narrative than believe that a carnivore diet is healthy, which in turn, by extension, would mean that you are accepting the possibility that the world we live in is extremely messed up, that dietary guidelines are completely backwards, and that people don't really have our best interests. So they'd rather live in a state of delusion than accept the truth and realize that the world is not the wonderful la la land happy place. Everything is in your interest that they thought it was. They don't want to accept uncomfortable outcomes. I think that's like a big one. So something that you touched on when we were talking about pharmaceuticals really quick was psychiatric problems and like things like depression, where I'm sure you've looked at them too. I've seen so many studies where sunlight or even placebos are having the same effect as the actual SSRIs or like psychotropics. So there's so many things that are being used instead of these medications that work on serotonin receptors, which don't even seem to actually be the cause, but that's another thing, that they don't even seem to work as it begins. But like it seems like there's so many other options for psychiatric issues, and maybe you can talk about that and how diet plays a role.
Oh, definitely. Well, first of all, with psychiatric issues, I think it depends on where somebody's coming from with their diet. So, are we talking about somebody that's got psychiatric issues and is eating the standard American diet, or somebody who is eating a paleo diet and it's not working, because I think fundamentally when it comes to like mood, say if somebody's constantly spiking their insulin and they've got blood sugar going like that, as I was saying, every time the cortisol goes up, the noradrenaline and the adrenaline go up as well. So you've got this constant cycling of neurotransmitters in the brain, which is unhealthy to start with. And when it comes to something like bipolar disorder, there's several studies underway at the moment. One of them is in Scotland to do with looking at bipolar disorder and the ketogenic diet, and it's to do with mitochondrial function, because it's accepted that it's sort of an energy crisis in the brain. And also previous studies on bipolar disorder have indicated metformin is very beneficial. And then when they've looked deeper into people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, a lot of them are insulin resistant as well. So just simply removing the carbs alone would probably help a lot of people get started. There are obviously more nuances that you could go into about making sure that they've got enough iron and B vitamins, because iron deficiency is catastrophic for mental health, because you need it to make neurotransmitters. And again, that's partly why, you know, with a plant-based diet where it's extremely difficult to absorb iron, there is a prevalence of mental health situations. And then also another really important factor with mental health would be the DHA, and you need the whole form. And people think it's just in fish, but you can get the whole form of DHA in meat, fat that's been grass-fed, butter. And DHA is absolutely crucial for brain function, probably the most important of all. And that's where, again, a dietary change would have massive effects on mental health. And again, it would be the exclusion of foods that provoke problems. So again, it's very hard. It's obviously impossible with a carnivore diet to eat things out of packages. I mean, there's carnivore crisps, but I don't know of anything else. And this is back to anything produced that's not produced, you know, by photosynthesis, that's been produced in a warehouse. As soon as you eat it, it's going to disturb your mitochondria. And there's way more to them than just making ATP. So it's just a no-brainer, sorry about the pun, to make changes to your way of eating for your mental health, because it does depend where someone's coming from. But I assumed you meant somebody doing standard American.
Yeah.
Or it could be somebody who's vegetarian or plant-based, because, you know, I know they're, you know, trying hard and they might be eating whole food, but if you're eating sort of a lot of inflammatory foods like nuts and peanuts and things like that, that's going to be quite irritating for the immune system. Also, we know about the gut-brain connection, that if you're filling your gut up with sort of plant toxins which are provoking it and poking holes and precipitating leaky guts, that's going to open you up to mental health problems, because the endotoxin can escape, and that can give people things like brain fog, and they'll then say they've got ADHD when actually it's probably just a gut issue. So there's a whole host of different things. And then with anxiety, I think sometimes it's worth doing sort of a food elimination procedure. And again, if you can't be bothered to do one food at a time, just eat just meat and then work backwards, and then you'll probably find the culprit. But again, with anxiety and depression, there is a circadian element. But I often find that when people start to do one change in their life, like changing their diet, and they feel better, they're much more willing to take on board other changes. Whereas if you ask them to exercise, go outside more, and change their diet all at once, they're so overwhelmed they can't do all of that. Whereas if you just ask them to do one or two things and they feel a bit better, it kind of is a roll to improvement.
Yeah, definitely. I think the psychiatric issues that people have, that's one of the more sad realizations that I've had since going carnivore and understanding more about the world and nutrition, just because I know so many people who deal with mental health issues and don't want to take medications, or no, I mean, they take medications, they don't want to do the lifestyle factor changes. I know a lot of people with bipolar, anxiety, depression, and yeah, it's just one of those things where it really makes life pretty bad, pretty miserable for a lot of people, and they don't want to make a change. It's kind of difficult to deal with.
But also the medication, first of all, there was a big study published this year, and it basically finally a meta study, multiple clinical trials and everything to prove once and for all that serotonin's got nothing to do with depression in the first
Yeah,
place.
yeah.
But we knew that anyway, because even people that have worked for Pfizer and such like, the scientists all know that they were sort of pushed into sort of cherry picking the data, and somebody just made up the serotonin hypothesis. I did used to know the story, and I'll remember as soon as we finished, but there was never any grounding to it anyway, and it's probably one of the biggest lies of the century. However, SSRIs are really complicated because they do other things, because they influence levels of estrogen and progesterone. So I can understand why something like Zoloft would make somebody feel a bit calmer or sleep better. So they do something, just not in the way that they're supposed to. Then when you get into psychiatric medication like lamotrigine and Topamax, the side effects are just crazy. Like you can go blind on Topamax, and I think in America it's like one of the most prescribed medications. And the more I look into it, the more I just think, how on earth can you live on these medications? Because the problem is worse in the US, because people can be on maybe 3 or 4 psychiatric meds, whereas here I've come across somebody on 2 very, very rarely. But I think it's just to do with it's what I was talking before about the SSRIs tend to stop the inquiring mind, and also lots of them are fluoridated as well, and fluorine is another interesting molecule which can be quite sedating. So how they actually even work, nobody knows. When you get into antipsychotics, they actually make people insulin resistant, and they don't deny that whatsoever. Eli Lilly said straight away olanzapine's terrible for weight gain. So you're basically making somebody insulin resistant, and we know that makes bipolar and schizophrenia worse. So in a way, I just can't get my head around it. And eventually, if you take SSRIs for long enough, you'll become insulin resistant as well. So they're basically making the problem that's driving the mental health problems in the first place, because the amount of mental health problems that are linked to insulin resistance are pretty large. So that's why I just despair. But again, people just want to be comfortable, or maybe people are frightened of sort of coming off them, or maybe they don't really understand how food could make a difference to their life. But I think it's like you said, because they've never felt normal, they don't know what it's like, they think what they feel is normal.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's just crazy the amount of diseases that are linked with mental health issues. It's such a powerful connection, and it makes me really wonder how this whole genetics is the cause paradigm is still so pervasive, because the connection is so strong between all these between one health issue and a whole host of additional ones. And on the serotonin thing, I don't even know how they're still allowed to prescribe them, because it's been proven that serotonin is not related. How does it even work? How are they allowed to do this? Do you know? Because it doesn't work. I mean, they proved it.
It's because the SSRIs are really complicated and they work by other mechanisms. So I looked into this, exactly the same thing as you. I thought, well, they definitely do something, because I've tried them. Other people I know swear by them, yet how are they working? So that they're basically either whoever invented, and also you've got to look at how they're marketed, that they're not just patented or marketed for depression. They're used for OCD, they're used for PMDD, which is like super PMT, for generalized anxiety disorder. So somebody's had multiple usages out of one drug. So I either think whoever designed Prozac in the first place was either a genius, knowing in 30 years time it's going to be used for all these things, or it was just a complete accident and somebody was throwing shit at the wall. Like what Topamax was meant to be an anti-diabetes drug, but then it does all these other things. Like there's about 10 things in the US it's prescribed for, from alcoholism to impulsive behavior to Tourette. So I don't know whether it's somebody very intricately designed these psychiatric meds knowing they were going to be used for the next decade, or whether it was an accident, because they do things that even now, if you look up Topamax and how it works, there are still lots of, well, we're not sure exactly which calcium channel it influences, and we don't know why it's therapeutic. So nobody actually knows how they work, but unfortunately they do, and people really like them. And again, there's obviously a big financial incentive, but on the other hand, not to be negative, they have saved a lot of lives as well, because I would imagine there are people who would have committed suicide without some of these medications. But people like my dad would just say, well, you know, the answer to life's problems isn't in bottles of alcohol and pills. You know, you should need to get to the root of it, not just medicate people. But I think it's a really, really interesting topic, psychiatric medication, because none of them work how they're supposed to.
Yeah. Okay, maybe let's pivot a little bit and get into deuterium, which
Okay.
yeah, so it's deuterium is so fascinating. It's so interesting. I'm so happy that I came across it. It made a lot of things line up for me. So what is deuterium and why might a ketogenic or carnivore diet be good looking through the lens of deuterium?
Okay, so we've got like should we just call it the light hydrogen and the heavy hydrogen? So we've
Sure.
got like a deuterium is a like an isotope of hydrogen, and it occurs naturally. It's not a pollutant or anything, and it's a heavy or a big hydrogen. And the way that I explain it to people, first of all, is in the mitochondria, because we've talked about them already. There's a little motor called the F1 ATPase, and the light hydrogens go down, the motor spins, and ATP comes out. Whereas if you try and put the deuterium down, it's like an adult going on children's toys. It basically breaks it. So as we like alluded to earlier, anything that breaks the mitochondria is a disaster. Not only that, the reason that the Krebs cycle is so complicated with all those maybe 20, well, I can't remember how many steps, like ridiculous amounts. The body's checking every single step to make sure there's a hydrogen, not a deuterium, on these molecules, so it doesn't accidentally stuff. It tries to stuff as few deuterium into the mitochondria as possible. So that's why there's this insane number of steps of why can't the glucose just go straight in? Then it's not just at the level of mitochondria we have the problem with deuterium. It can deuterate receptors, cholesterol, and other molecules because it's bigger and it's not the right, it hasn't got the right resonance or a shape. It's going to disturb other enzymatic functions. So it basically, in simple terms, it just slows everything down. And we don't want that. But on another more frightening front, it's actually can be aging, because in areas where there's very low deuterium, like in Siberia, this is how people discovered it. They've got sort of crazily longevity. And when they analyzed the glacial water, they found, I think it was something like 20 ppm. And
Really?
yeah, and then the other thing
Wow.
about deuterium is nobody can argue that, like at the moment, I think everything's about 150 ppm, because deuterium's gradually rising, and every single scientist or physicist or whatever says that when you get over 180 ppm, the organism is in terrible distress. It's very bad for it. So therefore, nobody on the planet can say deuterium or lots of deuterium is a good thing. I know it does have a small purpose in timekeeping in the body, but for the sakes of this argument today, is that you don't want a lot of deuterium, and there's a process you can do called deuterium depleting, and sunlight will do that. But as we're talking about food, if you burn fat, like your own fat, that is completely deuterium free. So if you're fasting, obviously you're just going to make really pure exclusion zone water that's got no deuterium in it. If you avoid grains and seed oils, because I think seed oils are something like 200 ppms, like an insane amount.
Yeah.
So they're super aging, and then grains have got a lot of deuterium, and then so fruit's got quite a lot as well. But then, as we know, the fruit's only around for 2 or 3 months in the year when it's kind of sunny, so we shouldn't be eating fruit out of season because of the deuterium. Then things like saunas and sweating can actually, and pissing and exuding water will get rid of some deuterium. And then there is obviously, no matter what, there are always people that want to cheat Mother Nature, like we've been talking about. They won't just do the lifestyle. They always want to buy the deuterium depleted water, which is about 20 ppm, but it's like $300 for a case.
Yeah.
So, And the point of that is, I just think, what's the point of spending $300 on this water if you're just going to keep on, as fast as you deplete it, you're putting more in with seed oils and stuff like that. So when I've done deuterium depletion, because I did the whole diet way, the saunas and everything, and then I bought a case of deuterium depleted water, and I did it right at the end of doing everything else right for a long time, and it does. I did feel really good, but it might have been because I love deuterium so much that like it was a placebo effect, but for people who think, well, I know, I'll just go out and buy loads of deuterium depleted water and drink it and I'll feel amazing. It's like, no, you won't. You'll shock your system so much, you'll feel shit. You've got to
Yeah.
do it the natural way first. And then the icing on the cake is the water.
Hmm. Yeah. You know, since the water here is so bad in LA, I've been trying to find ways to deplete my deuterium, like figure out ways to just live a healthier life. And so I kind of came to this conclusion, okay, well, how can I not drink water? I mean, like, how could I figure out how to not drink water and still be healthy? And so I found a couple things. Number one, raw milk, which works pretty well. It's relatively deuterium depleted. It's less deuterium than in the water today, just like just raw milk. And also eating raw meat has more water in it, more water soluble vitamins. So I don't need to drink as much raw milk. So I found like these two strategies so I can start depleting my deuterium a bit faster because I definitely have some to deplete. I didn't live too healthy before I started carnivore and this way of eating. I thought I was, but I wasn't. So I kind of have some work to do. But what are your thoughts on that? Just like what I'm
Oh, no,
doing.
that's really interesting because I was going to say dry fasting also is a shortcut for because you'll obviously make more of your own water. But to backtrack about the raw milk, that reminds me of something that a lot of people go, "Oh, all dairy is evil," but then I've found that when people fix their circadian rhythms and strengthen their constitution a bit, they're able to reintroduce raw dairy no problem at all. And I think what you just said about the raw dairy is fascinating because I like making kefir, and I would imagine that that would be low deuterium as well. And actually, I eat raw meat quite often as well. Like I'll like cook the outside a tiny bit, but like same as you. Like I wouldn't tell anybody, like my mum and dad or anything, but you know, it's like there are benefits to the raw meat, and also it's. I don't believe all of this. You must drink 8 glasses of water a day business either. I think I can't remember his name, but there's some professor that's really interested in deuterium, and he hardly drinks any water because of exactly this reason.
Laszlo
And
Boros.
hmm?
Laszlo Boros.
Yes, yeah, that's it. Yes, and it's like I think this idea of like drinking to excess. This is back to why some people say, "Oh, my carnivore and keto isn't working because my minerals are depleted," and they're like drinking 10 glasses of water a day, and it's like, well, that's probably why. You know, you're just weighing out all of your minerals. So yeah, I agree with you that. With you and your in your area, is it like 150 or 140 for the deuterium?
It's at least 150. It's really bad. Yeah. Yeah, it's the yeah. I need to. I like found what I'm doing now works for me. Like it works very well. I haven't drank water in a long time now. I think it's been a couple of weeks, and I feel really really good. Like because the raw milk is 92% water, but
Yeah.
it's very much deuterium depleted, and the raw meat has tons of just stuff in it. So I feel really good. I don't need water. It's great.
But actually, back to the raw meat, because I think I mentioned goose eggs before, but like goose meat is one of the like super duper quality meats because it's got the most vitamin C of all meats. And I think,
Mm,
again, if you don't cook your meat, and then the meat juice as well has got lots of vitamin C as well. But I think, again, there's going to be more to not cooking meat. I mean, I know evolutionarily we thrived a long time ago because of the ability to cook meat and just get more nutrients in. But there's also value in just eating something just as it is without, you know, cross-linking all of the protein structures and things like that. But yeah, no, I'm definitely with you. That's a really good point about the deuterium and the raw milk.
yeah, yeah. It really works. So for people who want to try that, it's worth a shot. And the raw meat, I found that I feel much better on it. You know, I've done a little bit of digging into populations that have done raw meat and thrived on raw meat, and people that thrive on raw meat compared to cooked. It seems like there are very few people who don't do well when they do raw meat, and I don't know, it just feels better. And I know we kind of talked about earlier when we were talking about testosterone, we were discussing dopamine and how stimulating it so often can be problematic for your baseline dopamine and your testosterone levels. And I kind of happen to be of the belief that outside of sex and hunting, stimulating dopamine is mostly like not good. Like we mostly shouldn't do it. It should be reserved for very important activities that are important for human life and preserving human life. So, like for example, when we eat food and when we consume sugar, it's very dopamine stimulating. Same with cooked meat. It's very stimulating. It's very tantalizing on the and like maybe you saw this in my interview with Varys, but he was talking about how raw meat it doesn't taste like anything. Like there's no taste to it at all, and it's not stimulating, but you feel really good from it. And I think the less we stimulate ourselves, the more healthy we can be. In theory, I believe that. So if we're not stimulating our senses with by eating cooked meat, we're eating raw meat instead, which isn't stimulating. We may put ourselves on a better path to good health. Of course, in addition to the increased amount of nutrients in there.
Oh no, I completely agree with you. That's why my way of eating is really boring, because I'll use salt and very occasionally spices, but I have gone on and on about this, that if stuff's too tasty, it's too stimulating. And, there's a load of reasons why humans overeat, because we're primed to, but then making food too tasty will just spike the dopamine. And I think people underestimate how tasty keto and carnivore can be. And then you're running into these problems that people have from other ways of eating. But also, I think, have you ever measured your blood sugar, raw meat versus cooked meat? Because I went through a phase. That's why I had to change things a bit, because and I know the reason now, I used to get slightly high blood sugar with carnivore, because I know some people have got SNPs anyway, that steak spikes their blood sugar. But then I found if it was raw, or the less I cooked it, the less it disturbed my blood sugar. I mean, again,
Why?
other factors were at play, and I was eating too much protein. And I'm not saying it was anything wrong with a carnivore diet. It just happened to be I did it wrong. But I think there would be a slightly different blood sugar response, whether the meat's cooked or because I know what you mean, that when it's cooked, it just seems to taste sweeter and nicer and stuff. I might test it, because I've got loads. I like testing things and finding different ways, because if you eat your food outside grounded in the sun, you get less of an insulin spike compared to inside under blue fluorescent light. So there's so many different ways to control, insulin resistance and stuff like that. Because have you come across anybody on the carnivore that had trouble with high blood sugar?
I have. I don't know. Yeah, it happens somewhat. I've seen it a couple times.
Yeah.
Do you know why cooked and raw might differ in their effect on blood sugar?
No, I'd have to look into it, because it only just popped into my head then when you mentioned it about it being too tasty and overstimulating. Because
Mm,
yeah, obviously the more tasty the food is, the more you start thinking about food in the day, and obviously it's a waste of brain power. Because that's when do you find that doing carnivore that you hardly ever think about food these
yeah,
days?
yeah. I don't fast anymore. Which I used to, but I kind of just eat when I want to. So yeah. I mean, like I don't think about it a lot, especially because now I'm doing raw meat, so I don't think about it really at all because it doesn't taste good. It's just like food. It's fuel. It doesn't have a taste. It doesn't have a taste to it. So
But
yeah, I
the
don't
other
think about
factor
it.
that's really important about raw meat and simplicity is the more decisions you've got to make. We've only got a limited amount of decisions per day, and that involves dopamine as well. So if all I've got to do is go and open like a packet of meat or whatever and just eat it, I don't have to think about, well, am I going to cook it? Am I going to make a sandwich? Am I going to like have chips with it? And I've already straight away eliminated 10 decisions. And I have noticed that, like at my age, my brain isn't what it used to be, and I just need every last little bit of brain power. And I've just found the more simple I've made my way of eating, the more I've got of brain power left to make important decisions and to be able to think on the spot.
That's such a great point. I've found that like something that I've really tried to do is limit the amount of difficult decisions I have to make by making decisions very easily. So if I really trying to trust instincts. Like if I think something is good, if someone tells me something and I have to make a decision, I don't overthink. I go with my instinct now because I don't want to dwell on decisions. And yeah, I mean that's so interesting. Yeah, we don't need to think about food very much. Since I'm doing raw, I don't think about it at all. I don't have to make choices. Maybe like, do you know any more about that? Like, why is it that not having to force yourself to make so many decisions is maybe a good thing for us? I've something I've never heard discussed before.
There's a really important study, right? If you in court cases that if you're going to make important decisions, do them early in the day, because when they studied like how lenient the judge was, whoever was in court last always had a worse sentence, because by the judge was already like tired and he'd made loads of decisions. So by the time it got to sort of making an important, another 100 important decision, he was his decision pool had just run out. And that's one of the studies that's what got me into this business about decisions, that and your brain doesn't, every single decision is just binary. Like it doesn't care if I'm thinking, shall I wear like black trousers or red trousers? That's one decision. That's one point. And then should I have cheese on my eggs? That's another one. And then my next one might be what topic shall I make a video about? And that's really important. So it doesn't understand the difference between important and not important. It's all just draining on the neurology. So the less stupid decisions to make, the better. That's why people like Jeff Bezos and all of them just wear the same clothes all the time. They've got like a whole wardrobe of black t-shirts and jeans. So again, all they've got to do is put that on, because they've got like billion-dollar sort of turnovers to manage, and they can't really afford to waste a single decision on should I wear green socks or red socks. But I think the same thing is with food, that the more that I've gone into like very simple ways of eating, my brain doesn't think about food. And again, it's sort of distracting. And I don't fast anymore in the morning either. That's to do with leptin and hormones. And I found it's to do with, I don't even think about it. And it frees up my brain to do intellectual tasks, because obviously food is like up here in how important it is. So it's a really important thing to my brain. So it's obviously going to prioritize food, whereas if it's happy, it doesn't think about it, and then I've got all my brain to do more interesting things. But that there is more to all of this. But the judge study is the scientific one, when they looked at, you're going to get a bad sentence if you're last, because the judge has already been rational and made important decisions. By the time it comes to your turn, he's just pissed off and wants to go home.
Yeah, I used to be such a dweller. I would just think and think and think. And if someone asked, what restaurant should we go to, I would think about it and be like weighing out options. Well, we could go do this, but like then we're not doing this. And there's so much to think about. And then now it's just whatever comes to my head, or give a really brief just thought, and I make the choice. It's so much more freeing, so much more freeing. So can we talk a little about the circadian rhythm? I know that you know a fair amount about this. How important is it, and how do we make sure it runs properly?
Okay, well, the thing that I think is the non-negotiable is seeing the sunrise and seeing the sunset, because that's when you see the sunrise, it tells your brain we're not making any more pineal hormones anymore. Let's switch to pituitary. So that's like setting off the day. It's telling our brain, okay, this is a new day. Then the next the non-negotiable is the UVA, because that makes all of your hormones. Then the next part of the circadian rhythm to do with the sun would be the vitamin D window. But in countries like the UK, we don't have any vitamin D now. Won't have any till next year. So the more you can go outside and get proper sunlight, because the blue light from the sun is the timekeeper, whereas the blue light from phones and devices, that's basically telling your brain it's 12 noon in June all the time. So obviously if you look at your phone all the time, your brain just thinks it's 12 noon, and you don't want that at 6 a.m. or 10 p.m. So the more you can go outside, and it takes about 2 minutes. So the minimum is 2 minutes. So say if you went out at the sunrise to tell your brain, okay, it's a new day, then you go out in that important window when all the hormones get made. That's usually enough to get all of them made. That would be before noon. Then the more often you go out and get blue light from the sun, it's constantly reminding your brain what time it is. Because in terms of quantum biology, when your brain is confused or there's too much chaos, it's just another way of describing inflammation. And then obviously once the sun's gone down, you want to block blue light as much as possible. So I have got blue light blockers, and I would normally wear them. So I would wear these because I don't want my brain thinking it's, because at the moment it thinks it's kind of 12 noon because of the blue light from my screen, and obviously it's not that.
Yeah.
So that would be using light. So that's one aspect of circadian rhythm, but then food and temperature are also timekeepers as well, because in the morning, your body's warming up. So that's when, if you want to do cold showers, you make yourself colder, but your body's going to like respond by warming up quicker. Whereas if you had a cold shower too late in the day, you're making your body hot when it wants to get cold to go to sleep. And that's why bedrooms always need to be cold and dark, because humans are meant to sleep in caves.
Yeah.
And then the food, that's why I always like see the sun, and then within half an hour to 30 to 60 minutes eat breakfast, because that sort of settles the cortisol down. And there are other reasons for setting the body clock there. And then technically you're not really supposed to eat after sundown, because evolutionarily we would have sort of packed up for the evening and be sort of ready to sleep. We wouldn't be hunting, although possibly with campfires humans may have eaten. So I think it's more, don't eat 4 hours before bed, because that comes back to the leptin, that if you eat too late in the evening, you're going to mess up the leptin pathway. So that's what I mean about like the body clock, whereas unfortunately shift workers can't do anything about that. But because light's a particle and a wave, you don't need to actually go outside, because some people can't. If you just crack a window open, the light will bend and come in, so that's going to be enough. And there's a huge amount of like glasses and software that people can use, like Iris is the popular one for computers to stop the blue light. And then you can make your iPhone red if you want, because interestingly, there's a link between red light and blue light and dopamine as well, that blue light's very dopamine stimulating and depleting. And when you make your phone red, it's not as attractive to look at anymore. So you just leave it alone. And that's why casinos are full of blue light as well. So that's what I mean about the circadian rhythm, because when you've got a strong circadian rhythm, all of the tasks in your body, like when to make hormones, there's 100,000 tasks per minute that need to be performed, and this is like each organ's got its own clock, that when it's all messed up, you've just got, it's like having an airport when it's not controlled. Airplanes will crash and people are going to miss flights and go to the wrong terminals. That's how the whole body clock works. And so many things are like circadian based, like a lot of gut problems. If you've got a terrible circadian rhythm, you're more likely to have leaky gut. And people always blame food. So there are multiple ways to sort of look at your circadian rhythm. And again, if your body doesn't know what time it is, it doesn't know whether it's meant to be storing energy or burning it. That's why there's a huge link with insulin resistance and obesity and bad sort of circadian rhythms. So it's all to do with the brain that's inside, like living in a cave. It has to always sort of know what time it is. And light is the strongest of all of the timekeepers.
Yeah. So should we go to bed probably at like 10? What do you think a good sleep schedule would be, like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. or something like that? I think that's what a lot of people that I
Yeah.
know in the space do.
Well, I think it's to do with, I always like want to be up to see the sunrise, and here it's about 7 a.m. So I'll always go, and that's a non-negotiable. But also in the winter, we make more melatonin anyway, so we naturally sleep a bit more, because seasonally, winter's a time when we do a lot of healing and regenerating, and it's not really the best time to try and build tons of muscle or get PBs in the gym. And it's a really good time to do a ketogenic diet or fasting, because the body anticipates scarcity, because maybe humans used to hibernate. And then when it comes round to spring, that's the sort of time of year for growth and sort of trying to get PBs in the gym, putting on muscle and stuff like that. So, and then when it gets to autumn, a lot of people go a little tiny bit insulin resistant, or their blood sugar and ketones, like I always measure mine, always go different, because my body knows there's all this fruit out, and it's obviously hoping I'm going to eat some of it for winter. So it's already like ready. When I eat the fruit, you're a bit more insulin resistant, so you're going to gain fat if you were to eat it in excess. But that's kind of an evolutionary thing as well. So the whole body clock isn't just on a 24-hour cycle. We've got a whole yearly cycle of a body clock as well, and there's like the best time to do certain things.
Mm.
And
So
absolutely, if somebody wants to try a ketogenic or carnivore diet that's never tried one before, now is the perfect time, because this is when there's hard, there's not, but there's a few apples left on trees, but your body's really designed to go keto or carnivore. And when you do something that's in line with your evolution and the seasons, you get really good benefits.
is sun helpful for putting on muscle then? Because if we're not supposed to do it in winter, if it's harder, then would sun be helpful?
Oh no, I don't know. I'm not saying that it's kind of harder. It's just when it comes to what goes on in the winter, it's to do with we just make more melatonin
Okay.
in our body, in our brains, hoping, oh, you're gonna go to bed earlier and then sleep longer, because then I've noticed, and you probably have as well, when it comes round to summer, you just seem to sleep less because there's obviously more light. But I think it's again that summer's the sort of more time for hypertrophy, whereas winter would be more, obviously, of course you can gain muscle at any time of the year, but if you really drill down into the tiny details, it's easier to do it in the spring and summer, because I think for certain men who are trying to gain muscle, who are hard gainers, it would matter to somebody like that, because they really struggle to put on muscle mass, and they're probably better to put their you can try really hard in the gym and then not get results, and it can be quite demoralizing. It just might be that try again in another season. But again, it's one of these things that the problem with winter in the West is we create these artificial summers. Like, we have our heating on, we have lots of light, so again our bodies think it's summer. So you are going to be able to gain muscle in the winter. Well, like, I wouldn't, because I usually turn off all my lights and I'm a bit funny about circadian rhythms, but other people create this artificial winter and it's all warm and sunny in their houses, and the poor body was hoping that you're going to like hibernate, so it'll still perform for you, but it's back to this is all back to turn your heating off, don't be afraid of the cold, don't wear 5 coats and stuff like that, because I just don't think it's very good for humans to be comfortable all the time. It's good for us to be hot and cold at different times, and to go without and be a bit uncomfortable, because we did evolve being cold and hungry and uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally get that. This has been great. I have two more questions for you.
Yeah.
So something that we talked about a little bit earlier was, or like not in this interview, but earlier, was when you were doing some research. I think it was with cholesterol, and you were told to sort of like go about the data in a way that would end up getting the optimal results. And it kind of led me to just think about how lots of the studies we have today don't really seem to make sense or be in alignment with the truths that you and I have each discovered. So, what are the problems with the ways current studies are done, and how does your experience in an actual like lab environment corroborate that?
Okay, so the first bit is like funding bodies, is that there are certain topics that are trending. So I'll just use my experience as an example. So in 2006, I did a postdoc on statins, and that was when it was all the rage. So basically, my supervisor was like really desperate to set up this experiment to show that statins potentiated beta 2 receptors in the heart, so therefore it could be helpful for heart failure. So that was like the idea. So she had a heart set on the statins being helpful. So then what would happen then is, it's sort of like you can accidentally or on purpose design experiments to give you the data that somebody wants, because you want to fit a narrative. Then in a lab upstairs to me, there was a very aggressive professor, and his postdoc, who was a friend of mine, but he basically pulled him into his office and said, look, like, I've written the paper, this is the results, this is everything, this is the box for you to do. Go and do some experiments and give me data that produces numbers so I can publish the paper, because I've written it all. I just need the lab data, and do it now. And if you question me, I'll sack you. So it's kind of that kind of attitude, that like that example I gave of my friend, that's an extreme end. But the other problem is it's publish or perish as well. So we have always these problems of, and I can't remember what the number is. It's something horrific, like 90% of studies can't be replicated. No matter how much people try, even really important ones. And it's a really horrific number of unreplicatable studies, because in science, everything has to be novel or novo, and nobody wants to go and, like, no one's going to give you a grant. If I said, well, actually, I was really interested in these studies in the 1970s, I want to, like, do all these experiments again, or will be like, well, no, you can't have the money because it's not novel, it's not bell ringing sort of cutting edge science. So that's the other problem, is nobody ever repeats experiments. And when they actually have gone back and repeated them, like I said, 90% of them, I can't remember, it's some horrific number like that, couldn't be repeated. So that was the kicker for me that really rocked me to the core about, well, if that many can't be repeated, that's kind of that frightens me more than people just sort of making up data and rubbing out some bands on a gel. Or the other way you can manipulate scientific data is statistics, because you can run the same numbers through different statistical tests, and sometimes it's significant and sometimes it isn't. So then people will just publish, oh, I've got 1 star, it is significant because I ran a t-test, whereas if they did an ANOVA, it wasn't significant. So you've got issues with error. Sometimes people don't put their error bars on their data either. So there's all sorts of, like, ways that there are problems. Also, we've got the desk drawer issue. That's, there's all these studies that we never published because we thought they weren't important, but actually they are crucially important in some jigsaw somewhere. And there isn't the journal of all the experiments that didn't work, because they're all really important too. So there are fundamental flaws in scientific data, but also you've got to look to see who's funding it, because even if it's something like, say, the Wellcome Trust or the British BBSRC, say, in this country, they still want to do something that's sort of trendy or novel, then anybody can fund. Like, there was a study when I was at university, Tetley wanted somebody to publish a paper to say that green tea was anti-cancer, and it was like, we'll give you £250,000 and this is what we would like you to do. So you've got big, pharmaceutical, agricultural companies have all got their fingers in the research pies as well. And because scientists are really badly paid, people will do anything because they just want to put food on the table for their families too. So it's all back to what we've been talking about, whether people are malevolent, or are they desperate, or are they stupid, or have they been bullied into something.
And when you say that, it really all starts to click why we see so many bad studies. And I was just thinking about it, and like what I've been through in school, where people just manipulate results to please the teacher and to get the right outcomes. And I thought initially that there's no way this happens on a larger scale and more important studies, but then I kind of figured, well, I mean, why not? These people are funded, they need to get a certain results to appease their superiors. So I guess it all sort of is not too far away from what I was doing when I was in high school in science classes. So okay, last question for you.
So have you seen the film Chicken Run? About when they line up all the chickens and ask, have you laid any eggs this week? That's what it's like with group meetings and data, that if you haven't got any data for group meeting, it's like, I'm sure people are familiar with that film, that like chickens were trying to lend other people eggs and stuff. And if you hadn't laid an egg, you got made into a chicken pie in the film. And that's how it was in our group meeting. So because, say, if someone's in their early 20s and they're terrified of their PhD supervisor and they're going to get humiliated in a group, of course they might make up data or rub out something. So I think some of it's fear, and then for older people it's their careers and their families and their profession. That, again, humans are not, I don't think humans are bad, we're not naturally bad. We want to survive, and fear is a massive driver, and being humiliated and failing is a massive terror driver for people, especially when they're younger. So if you haven't got any data, then it's like the chickens in Chicken Run, it's all very stressful. I remember that from my time. So there are all kinds of angles to get people to publish. But then, I mean, some of the studies I look at, it's just people write an abstract, and then when you read the paper, it's the conclusion in the abstract's not even what the paper's about. So there's all sorts of sort of interesting things that go on.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, last question. So some people experience some issues with carnivore. They might get some electrolyte problems, or there's some problems that people have. Can you maybe talk about some of the problems that you've seen people experience, or maybe that you've experienced yourself, and then maybe discuss some of the anecdotes to them?
Oh, there's loads of them because let me think. So for one of them, the favorite one is about the histamines, and that's partly, I think, women over like 45, it would tend to be just a bit more sensitive to histamines, and that can be because aged meat for some reason seems to be prized here, that it's like twice the price to get some old beef which is full of histamines. But I think I'm pretty sure when I was talking to somebody about quantum biology, that infrared can also help calm down the histamines, as can a high dose of vitamin C, but that's a different topic. So that's one of them that people sometimes encounter, are the histamines, because you get a reaction that it doesn't correlate with when you ate the food. And it's usually beef or mackerel, those kind of foods that are more likely to be. But that's something that, you'd have to eliminate the beef or the mackerel or the high histamine food and see if it was that. Um, the electrolytes one is really complicated because our ancestors used to eat things like clay, and they've got minerals, and also mineral water as well. Back in the day, there would have been a lot more minerals in the water, but I think you could mitigate some of it by drinking, like I always drink mineral water. And then back to what I was talking about before, that people either drink far too much water or they don't have enough salt, but then you have to play around with potassium and sodium yourself, because there is a particular ratio and it's not the same for every person. You can't even get hair tests to see if it's out. So that would be one of them. It would be issues with potassium and sodium. Unfortunately, because of the poor quality of soil, I think you've got quite a good chance of having a magnesium deficiency. It does some water. There's in certain areas there's loads of magnesium in just tap water, but that, I would say, if somebody's going to run into a mineral deficiency, it would be magnesium. I think people are gonna get annoyed about that, but it's something that our ancestors would have drunk mineral water and eaten clay and got magnesium there. Because when it comes to high magnesium foods, because it's in chlorophyll, it does come from plants. Whether you can actually get magnesium out of the chlorophyll, I don't know. But then things like pumpkin seeds and beans are touted to have a lot of magnesium in them as well, but then it's not worth eating them just for the magnesium. So that could be the mineral deficiency. Then you can just run into certain issues with macros, of people either eating far too much protein and not enough fat, and that can be quite stressful for the body. I think we were talking about cortisol before, that sometimes when certain people, not everybody, eat excessive amounts of protein, and maybe they don't have enough digestive enzymes, maybe they don't have enough stomach acid, that can ramp up people's cortisol. But then you can do it the other way, that you can eat, you have to try really hard to eat, say, a 2-to-1 fat to protein. That would just mean somebody might be protein deficient, but that's too technical. So I'm trying to think of other problems that people have. It's just the usual stuff with any way of eating, that people just eat, say, sausages and processed meat, because you're just eating a load of nitrates and sulfites and stuff like that. Then there's always the big debate about organ meats, that some, like Liver King, says to eat liver every day, but then if you read the guide, I think it's probably about 100 grams a week, or distributed over the week, because of the copper and vitamin A. So that's the other debate, because I know there are certain people like Bart and Sean Baker that are really keen on muscle meat, and then there are other people like me or whatever who eat all kinds of other bits as well. So then the other debate, which I find interesting, I was going to ask you about this, is about the methionine and the glycine ratio, that because I eat lots of bone broth, and then there was a big craze about 2 years ago of people putting collagen powder on steaks, that you could knock your ratios out a little bit there. Then there's the problem of, we've talked about good eggs and bad eggs, that obviously, and then there would be crap butter and good butter, when you get your fat sources. Then the other one is that people do this on keto as well, is eat too much heavy cream, because it is pasteurized, and for some reason that just seems, particularly women, is just terrible for weight. When it comes and inflammation, when it comes to raw cream, that's a whole different category. So that's what I found. And then the whole discussion about cheese, that like I think what's it called, Parmesan, that's one of the few raw cheeses you can get. So people eat, again, too much cheese. And then we get into the dairy debate. But I think a lot of dairy issues, it's either a circadian rhythm or somebody's got an underlying gut problem, and that's why they can't have the dairy. There's, what else is there? Oh, the thing is, there's like so many different things. Sometimes I need to like have the person will come and say, oh, I'm experiencing this, what do I do? Because what things have you come across that people are experiencing? And then sometimes that prompts my brain a bit to like think of the answer.
Yeah, so sometimes people, they're like tired, or they have digestive problems, like they have too much fat in the stool kind of thing, or um they like they're like having trouble putting on weight. There's like a whole bunch of different things that people have.
Oh, I know. This is back to, I know, because the thing is, it's such a long time ago that I got into this. But I think sometimes people do really watery poo one day, and then they're constipated the next on carnivore. And then, yes, that's one of them. But isn't that just the gut adapting? Because this is all to do with peeling the plaster off slowly or ripping it off all in one go. Because some people transition into carnivore from paleo, and they go about a year and eventually end up carnivore, and other people just do it overnight. So I think it depends on how you're transitioning. What other things did you say? Because I didn't know the answer to one of them.
Oh,
Oh, feeling tired, was that one of them?
yeah, that people have talked about that, yeah.
And then there's
Like,
also, isn't it? I think it's just suddenly to eat way more protein. Wouldn't I always would suggest apple cider vinegar and some digestive enzymes. But also the other really important thing, and I'm guilty of this, is not chewing my food properly. Because if you're coming from a way of eating with sort of just mush, when you've got to motor your way through protein and chewing and meat and stuff, it's not what you're used to. So I think sometimes people are not chewing the meat, because it is 30 chews per swallow.
hmm.
And a lot of the time when I'm in a rush, I've done maybe 5. I did it earlier before this, and I just thought, why have you just done that? You've just like, that's going to cause loads of trouble later. And even for very diligent people that eat slowly, I bet if they counted, they're not doing 30 chews. And I think it's, for somebody who's moving into it, the whole chewing business is even more important. Because I know the vegans like to say, oh, the meat rots in your gut, and I don't buy that. But I think if you wolf it down, which I have done, and I think everybody's guilty of it, it's just simple things like that can be a problem. The tiredness, what kind of carnivore were they doing? Because there's so many different flavors, because you can get the nose to tails, but then you can get the fish eating carnivores as well.
Yeah. I It's been a couple of different examples. I like, if you ask me, I think it's a couple things with dealing with the transition. I also think too much cooked meat
Yeah,
is an issue, because they're not getting enough water soluble vitamins. They're probably maybe deficient in vitamin C or B vitamins as well, since they're all kind of destroyed by heat. And also, the methionine glycine thing is really interesting. But I think people eat way too much mince or ground beef.
yeah,
They're not getting enough glycine. I mean, I eat so many ribs.
yeah.
I eat lots of like short ribs and stuff with the bone on it, so you get that collagen, you get the glycine. People have their methionine levels are too high. I think that's also neglected a lot, maybe.
But also the other thing about bone picking is really important for our teeth, that we're meant to bite down on stuff. We're not meant to eat mush and chips and squishy stuff and pizzas. We're meant to, pick the meat off the bone too. So, and that again, like that just reminded me of something that kind of slows people down a bit. But yeah, the whole thing about the minces, I think it's again just too, if you think back to our ancestors, they might have had some mince, but they would have picked it off the bone.
Yeah.
And for some reason, I'm not sure if you've noticed this, that like the mince just seemed, the reason I object to it is because it's all been minced up and there's a bigger surface area to touch all the plastic it can be wrapped in. And for some reason, it's just, to me, it's probably been more messed about with than just a piece, that I can just have the piece. And I don't know, because with a mincing machine, you don't know what it's been in. And I mean, mince is massively useful and very versatile, but again, it's like lazy person food in some ways. I'm not sure if like you think that too, but it's obviously a really important part of carnivore. But like anything, you have to think back to what did our ancestors do, and if you want good teeth, you need to bite down on sort of something with substance. Obviously, not try and crack the bones, but it's really important for jaws and teeth as well to have that pressure.
Yeah, I stopped buying ground beef, and I'm gonna do a video on this because it doesn't make sense for us to eat ground beef. It's way too soft. We don't have to work our
Mm.
jaws at all. If we want to have a good jawline and a strong teeth and just a good face, we need to get big pieces of meat and bite it and bite into it and not use like, not be so clean with everything, like actually bite into the meat and rip it off and work those muscles. And like I looked at Weston Price's work, and he's showing the jaws of people in the early 1900s, just beautiful, wide, strong jaws, and we don't have that anymore. And so I'm really trying to. I'm not buying ground beef at all, for
Well,
that
actually,
reason.
that's really interesting. So from a quantum perspective, when you put shearing forces through fascia, it produces electrons and hyaluronic acid. So our jaws are designed to wrench and pull. So you're putting a shearing force when you're pulling the meat, if it's just a chunk, but also then you're putting like a pressure force if you're biting down. So evolutionarily, we're supposed to do that. And also when it comes to the neurology, the closer something is to the brain, the more important it is, like eyes being out of line or jaws that like TMJ problems are massive. And I think a lot of it is people just are not ripping, like they're not biting enough. I know it sounds
Mm,
weird, but it's like TMJs, people are forever complaining about them and headaches. So just like eating messily, like children do, is probably a good thing.
yeah, I think so too. Um, okay, great. That we got through all my questions. It took a while, but I really appreciate you coming on to do this, and I think it's going to help a lot of people. So thanks again so much for doing this. Do you have any last comments, and also where can people find your channel?
I know what comments do I have. Yeah, thanks for not throwing any curved balls at me. I was a bit worried with you and your intellect of what was going to come out. Oh yes, I just go by Busy Superhuman, and I'm like Instagram and TikTok. You can find me on there and YouTube. But then my name is Sarah Pugh. So if you just type it in, like it'll come up with. If you want to contact me, I'm quite amenable to questions as long as they're not too sort of medical and stuff like that. But I'll always reply to things like comments and stuff like that.
Mm, great. Well, again, this has been awesome. I'm sure people are gonna love the video, and just have a great rest of your night. Bye.